Edward Dong, the cold and calculated head of the Dong-Hyun Syndicate in Seoul, has everything except the voice of his 4-year-old daughter, Isabel. Since the mysterious death of her mother, Isabel has been trapped in a world of silence. Everything changes during a heavy Seoul downpour when Edward's motorcade nearly strikes a homeless woman, Sarah, and her young child on the street. Moved by a rare moment of pity, Edward brings the woman into his estate as a maid. The Ice King's world is shattered when Isabel, who hasn't spoken in years, points at Sarah and utters her first word. Mama! As Sarah steps into the role of a pretend mother to help Isabel heal, a dangerous secret emerges. Sarah isn't just a stranger. She holds the key to the medical conspiracy that tore her own family apart and led to the adoption of Edward's daughter. The Korean Mafia boss's little girl muttered her first word.
Mama!
She didn't look at her father, the most feared man in Seoul. She pointed a trembling finger at the new black maid standing in the shadows and whispered, Mama. Edward Dong wasn't a man who believed in miracles. He was the Ice King of the Dong-Hyun Syndicate, a man whose heart had turned to stone the day his wife died and his daughter, Isabel, went silent. For 1,460 days, Isabel lived in a world of absolute stillness. Doctors called it trauma. Edward called it a curse. But on a rainy Sunday, the silence was shattered. 2 hours earlier, Edward's armored SUV had nearly crushed 2 homeless figures huddling on a cardboard box in an alley. Sarah, a woman with eyes full of 1,000 tragedies, had shielded her own child from the rain. Moved by a flicker of humanity, Edward brought them into his fortress to serve as help. He didn't know that by opening his gates, he was inviting in the one person who could burn his empire down, or finally heal it. Because when Isabel saw Sarah, she didn't see a maid. She saw the face from her dreams. The neon lights of Seoul's Myeongdong district blurred into streaks of pink and blue as the rain turned the pavement into a shimmering mirror. Edward Dong sat in the back of his armored limousine, his face a mask of cold indifference. To the city, he was the Ice King, a man who controlled the flow of commerce and shadows alike. But inside the car, the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of Isabel, his 4-year-old daughter. She was staring out the window, her eyes vast and empty. She hadn't spoken since the night her mother, Edward's late wife, had passed away in a tragic accident. Edward had bought her every toy in the world, hired the finest doctors, and even built a private playground inside his fortress-like estate. Yet the silence remained. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt. "What is it, Jin?" Edward asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Sir, there's a woman. She's in the middle of the road," his lead bodyguard replied, his hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. Edward looked out the window. Under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, he saw Sarah. She was drenched to the bone, her thin coat wrapped around her own 5-year-old daughter, Joy. They were huddled on a flattened cardboard box, Sarah's body acting as a human shield against the freezing rain. She wasn't begging for money. She was simply holding her child, whispering something into her ear that made Joy smile despite the cold. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced Edward's heart. He remembered his own mother, long ago, standing in the cold before he built his empire. "Bring them inside," Edward commanded. "Sir," Jin looked confused. "The estate there, they're homeless." "I didn't ask for your opinion, Jin. Bring them in. Give the woman a job. My daughter's room needs cleaning, and I am tired of seeing the ghosts of my past on my way home." 2 hours later, Sarah and Joy stood in the grand foyer of the Dong estate. The marble was so white it hurt Sarah's eyes, and the warmth of the house felt like a physical weight. Sarah clutched Joy's hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent years running from the shadows of a past she couldn't remember, a hospital room, a missing baby, and a life stolen from her. Edward stood at the top of the dual staircase, looking down at them like a judging god. "You will be a maid, Sarah. You will work in the East Wing. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not let your child wander." Sarah bowed, her voice a soft, melodic rasp. "Thank you, Mr. Dong. You've saved our lives." As Sarah was led toward the servants' quarters, a small figure appeared from behind a pillar. Isabel, the silent princess of the house. She stared at Sarah, her little chest heaving. Sarah stopped and knelt, ignoring the protocol. She reached out and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her own daughter's face, then looked at Isabel with a gaze so full of maternal warmth it seemed to light up the dark hallway. Isabel's lips trembled. A sound, small and rusty like a hinge that hadn't moved in years, broke the stillness of the mansion. "Mama." The tray in the housekeeper's hand hit the floor with a deafening crash. Edward froze on the stairs, his blood turning to ice. The girl who hadn't made a sound in 4 years had just identified a stranger as her mother. The silence that followed Isabel's voice was heavier than the 4 years of stillness that preceded it. Edward stood frozen on the marble stairs, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He looked at Sarah, a woman who had been a beggar on the street just hours ago, and then at his daughter, whose face was transformed by a light he thought had been extinguished forever. "What did you say, Isabel?" Edward's voice was a ghost of a whisper. Isabel didn't look at him. Her small, trembling hand remained pointed at Sarah. "Mama," she repeated, the word clearer this time, ringing through the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know this child, yet the moment the girl spoke, Sarah felt a phantom ache in her own womb, a memory of the daughter she was told had died in a cold hospital room 5 years ago. Without thinking of the Ice King watching her, Sarah stepped forward and knelt in front of Isabel. "I'm here, sweet girl," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Edward's shock quickly turned into his trademark calculation. He saw the way Isabel leaned into Sarah's touch. He knew the doctors had said that if Isabel ever spoke, it would be the key to her recovery. He couldn't let this woman leave, but he also couldn't allow a stranger to believe she had a claim to his daughter. "Jin, take the other child to the playroom," Edward commanded, descending the stairs. He stopped inches from Sarah. "You, my office, now." Inside the oak-paneled study, the atmosphere was suffocating. Edward sat behind his massive desk, the shadows making him look like a statue of obsidian. Sarah stood before him, her chin tilted up despite her fear. "I don't know why she called me that, Mr. Dong," Sarah said firmly. "I've never seen your daughter before tonight." "It doesn't matter why," Edward snapped. "What matters is that for the first time in 4 years, my daughter is no longer a prisoner of her own mind. You are no longer a maid, Sarah. From this moment on, you will be Isabel's private governess. You will eat with her, sleep in the room adjacent to hers, and most importantly, you will let her call you whatever she needs to call you." "You want me to lie to her?" Sarah asked, horrified. "To pretend I'm her mother?" "I want her to get better." Edward slammed his hand on the desk, but then his voice softened, revealing a sliver of the desperate father beneath the mafia boss. "She is all I have. If she needs you to be mama to find her way back to the world, then that is what you will be. In exchange, I will clear your debts, provide for your daughter Joy, and give you a life you never dreamed of." Sarah looked at the door, thinking of Joy, then back at Edward. She saw the loneliness in his gray eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I will do it for Isabel," she said quietly, "but I won't lie to her forever. Children deserve the truth." Edward leaned back, a cold smile returning to his face. "In my world, Sarah, the truth is whatever I say it is." He stood up and walked toward her, pausing so close she could smell the sandalwood and rain on his suit. For a second, the air between them hummed with an unexpected tension, not of hate, but of two broken souls recognizing one another. "One more thing," Edward added, his voice grazing her ear. "The syndicate expects me to marry soon. My enemies are watching. If they see you as a maid, they will see a weakness. From tomorrow, the world will not see you as a beggar. They will see you as my fiancé." Life at the Dong estate transformed overnight. Sarah was no longer scrubbing floors. She was being draped in silks and taught the etiquette of a syndicate queen. Yet, despite the luxury, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. Her only solace was the bond forming between the two children, Isabel and Joy. They played in the sun-drenched east wing as if they had been sisters in another life. Edward watched them from the shadows of the hallway, his cold heart thawing by millimeters. He observed Sarah not with the eyes of a boss, but with a growing, quiet fascination. She didn't fear him. When she looked at him, she didn't see a monster. She saw a father who was lost. One evening, as the violet dusk settled over Seoul, Isabel became restless. A thunderstorm was rolling in, the distant rumble of thunder triggering the trauma of the night she lost her mother. She began to hyperventilate, her small hands clutching her ears. The lighting in the bedroom of the luxury mansion is dim and blue. A small girl is trembling in bed while a woman sits beside her, reaching out with a comforting hand. Sarah rushed to her side, pulling Isabel into her lap. She began to hum a melody, low, haunting, and incredibly beautiful. Then she began to sing lyrics in a soft, soulful voice. "The moon is a needle, the stars are the thread, sewing a blanket for your sleepy head." Isabel's breathing slowed. Her eyes closed, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Edward, who had been standing in the doorway, suddenly stepped into the light. His face was deathly pale, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion. "Where did you learn that song, Sarah?" Sarah looked up, startled. "My mother used to sing it to me. It's an old folk song from my village. Why?" Edward walked to the bedside, his hand trembling as he touched the velvet headboard. "That was the song my wife sang to Isabel every night. She told me she wrote it herself. She said it was a Dong family secret that no one else in the world knew." Sarah stood up, her heart racing. "That's impossible. My mother passed that song down through generations. I sang it to my baby, the one I lost 5 years ago at St. Mary's Hospital." The air in the room turned frigid. Edward's mind raced through the archives of his memory. 5 years ago. St. Mary. The same night Isabel was born. The same night his wife had supposedly undergone an emergency C-section while he was away on business. Sarah lost in thought, imagining a dark, clinical hospital hallway from 5 years ago. Edward and Sarah stared at each other in the present realization dawning on their faces. "Sarah," Edward whispered, his voice cracking. "My wife couldn't have children. The doctors told us it was a miracle pregnancy. I never questioned it because I wanted it to be true." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old photograph he kept in his wallet, the only photo of Isabel's birth mother. Sarah gasped. The woman in the photo was wearing a nurse's uniform, and she was standing next to a woman Sarah recognized instantly. The head administrator of the orphanage where Sarah had been told her own child had died. The standard of excellence Edward had built his life upon was crumbling. He realized then that his entire family legacy might have been built on a lie, a theft of the most cruel kind. "I think," Edward said, his gaze locking onto Sarah's with a new, fierce intensity, "that we weren't brought together by a car accident, Sarah. We were brought together by a debt that I didn't even know I owed." The Ice King did not sleep that night. While Sarah slept fitfully in the East Wing, Edward descended into the sub-basement of his estate, a high-tech command center where his private intelligence team operated. "I want everything on St. Mary's Hospital from 5 years ago," Edward commanded, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of a dozen monitors. "Check the nursery logs, the staff rotas, and the disposal of medical waste, and find the nurse in this photo." By dawn, the digital shadow world had yielded its secrets. The nurse in the photograph, a woman named Nurse Han, had disappeared from all public records 3 months after Isabel's birth. But more damning was the hospital's internal ledger. On the night Isabel was born, there were only 2 female births recorded. One was to Sarah, the homeless woman now in his house, and the other to Edward's late wife, Chloe. However, Chloe's file was a masterpiece of forgery. The blood types didn't match. The thumbprints were smudged. Edward returned to the main floor as the sun began to peek over the Seoul skyline. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Joy and Isabel. The 2 girls were sitting at the island, giggling as they shared a bowl of fruit. Looking at them now, Edward felt a jolt of electricity. They didn't just look like friends, they had the same shape to their eyes, the same curve to their smiles. "Sarah," Edward said, his voice unusually thick, "I need a sample of your hair, and Isabel's." Sarah froze, the whisk in her hand dripping batter. She looked at Edward's face, stripped of its mafia mask, revealing a man terrified of the truth. "You found something, didn't you?" "I need to be sure," Edward replied. The next 6 hours were the longest of Edward Dong's life. He used a private lab that owed him his life. When the encrypted file finally arrived on his phone, he was standing in the garden, watching Sarah teach Isabel how to plant a sunflower. He looked at the screen. Maternity match, 99.99%. Isabel was not the daughter of his late wife. She was the child Sarah had grieved for 5 years. His wife had used her family's connections to steal a perfect child from an undocumented, vulnerable woman to satisfy the syndicate's demand for an heir. Edward walked into the garden. His footsteps, usually heavy and intimidating, were light. He stopped behind Sarah, who was laughing as Isabel accidentally splashed water on her shoes. "Sarah," Edward said, his voice trembling. He handed her the phone. Sarah read the results. The phone slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the grass. She turned to look at Isabel, not as a governess, not as a pretend mother, but as her flesh and blood. She let out a sob that sounded like 5 years of suppressed pain finally breaking free. Isabel ran to her, hugging her knees. "Mama, why you cry?" Sarah collapsed to her knees, pulling Isabel into a fierce, desperate embrace. "Because I found you," she sobbed. "I finally found you." Edward stood over them, his hand resting tentatively on Sarah's shoulder. He was a man who lived by a code of an eye for an eye. But as he looked at the mother and daughter he had accidentally reunited, he realized the only way to pay this debt was to give them everything he had. The revelation that Isabel was Sarah's biological daughter changed the gravity of the Dong estate. The air, once cold and sterile, was now filled with a warmth that Edward found both terrifying and addictive. Isabel and Joy sat on the living room rug, surrounded by building blocks. To the world, they looked like 2 children of different backgrounds. To Edward, looking through the lens of the DNA results, the resemblance was now undeniable. The same spirited sparkle in their eyes, the same stubborn tilt of their chins. They were sisters, not by blood, but by a shared soul and a stolen past. The 2 little girls, one in a yellow dress and one in a cream sweater, sitting on a plush white rug, their heads leaning together as they play with colorful blocks. "They need to know, Edward," Sarah said, standing beside him. She was no longer wearing the maid's uniform, but a soft cashmere wrap Edward had gifted her. Her dignity had returned, but her eyes were shadowed with concern. "We can't keep them in this bubble forever." "I know," Edward replied, his voice raspy. "But there are legalities. My late wife's family, the Kangs, are powerful. If they find out the miracle heir is actually yours, they will see it as a stain on their reputation. They won't go quietly." "I don't care about their reputation," Sarah whispered, her hand brushing Edward's arm. "I care about my daughters." Edward felt a jolt at the word daughters. Sarah had already claimed Isabel, and in his heart, Edward realized he was beginning to claim Joy. But before he could respond, Jin entered the room, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a visitor. Chairman Kang is at the gate. He heard rumors of a new woman in the house, and he's demanding to see his granddaughter." Edward's jaw tightened. The Kangs were the ones who had likely facilitated the hospital switch to ensure their bloodline, or so they thought, sat on the Dong throne. A fleet of silver luxury cars parked outside the massive iron gates of the estate, their headlights cutting through the evening mist. "Sarah, take the girls to the playroom. Do not come out until I call for you," Edward commanded. He met Chairman Kang in the grand hall. The older man was draped in traditional silk. His face a map of arrogance. "Edward, I hear you've picked up a stray from the streets. My daughter hasn't been gone 2 years and you're already replacing her with this." "I am not replacing anyone, Chairman," Edward said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "I am simply correcting a mistake your family made 5 years ago at St. Mary's Hospital." The chairman's face paled for a split second before hardening. "Be careful, Edward. You may be the king of Seoul, but a king without a legitimate heir is just a man with a target on his back." "Isabel is my heir." Edward stepped closer, his shadow looming over the older man. "And she has finally found her voice. If you try to take that from her, if you try to touch the woman who gave her that voice, I will dismantle the Kang Empire brick by brick. Amicably, if you let me, but I will do it." As the chairman retreated, Edward turned to find Sarah watching from the shadows of the balcony. She saw not the mafia boss, but the protector. In that moment, the contract between them shifted. It was no longer about a lie. It was about a future they were both willing to fight for. He weight of the syndicate, and the Kangs felt 1,000 miles away as Edward's silver SUV pulled onto the private sands of a secluded beach on Jeju Island. He had cleared the area for the weekend. No bodyguards in sight, just the sound of the turquoise waves crashing against the shore. For the first time in his adult life, Edward Dong wasn't wearing a suit. In a simple navy sweater and rolled-up trousers, he looked less like a king and more like a man. "Is it always this quiet?" Sarah asked, stepping onto the sand. She watched Joy and Isabel sprint toward the water's edge, their laughter carried by the salt breeze. "In my world, silence is usually a warning," Edward admitted, walking beside her. "But this is different. This is peace." They spent the afternoon in a way Edward never thought possible. He found himself kneeling in the wet sand, helping Joy build a castle while Isabel brought him treasures in the form of smooth sea glass. He learned that Joy was the brave one, daring the waves to catch her, while Isabel was the observer, careful and sweet. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in strokes of violet and burning orange, Edward watched Sarah. She was standing by the water, her hair blowing wild, looking at the girls with a gaze of pure, unfiltered love. "You're a natural father, Edward," Sarah said softly as he joined her. "You don't have to be the Ice King with them." "I don't know how to be anything else," he confessed, looking at his hands. "I've spent 15 years building walls. I don't know how to live without them." Sarah turned to him, her eyes reflecting the setting sun. She reached out, her hand resting over his heart. "The walls are already cracking, Edward. Isabel broke the first stone when she spoke. You broke the rest when you brought us here." The air between them changed. It wasn't the tension of a contract or the fear of a scandal. It was a magnetic pull. Edward leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the mafia boss vanished. He was just a man who had finally found the home he didn't know he was looking for. "I want this to be real, Sarah," he whispered. "Not for the syndicate, not for the press, for us." Before Sarah could answer, Isabel ran up to them, clutching a small, perfect yellow shell. She pushed it into Edward's hand. "For you, Papa, so you stay happy." Edward looked at the shell, then at Sarah, then at the two girls. He realized then that he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had a family now, and he would change the world to keep them. The warmth of the Jeju sun was quickly replaced by the cold, sterile air of the syndicate's boardroom in Seoul. Edward stood at the head of a long obsidian table, facing 5 elders who had managed the Dong-Hyun Empire since before he was born. In their eyes, Sarah wasn't a woman or a mother. She was a security breach. "Edward," Chairman Min began, his voice like dry parchment. "We have seen the reports. You have brought a woman of no standing into the ancestral home. You have allowed her to influence the heir. And now, rumors of a medical scandal involving the Kangs are threatening our stock prices." Seated in a dark, high-tech boardroom are 5 elderly men in traditional dark hanboks, across from a younger man in a sharp black suit. The atmosphere is heavy with tension. "The Kangs committed a crime against a mother," Edward replied, his voice echoing with a new moral authority. "I am simply ensuring the standard of excellence this family claims to uphold actually means something." "We do not care about mothers, Edward. We care about stability," another elder barked. "The Kangs are demanding you marry their youngest niece to smooth over this misunderstanding. If you refuse, they will pull their investments. The syndicate will bleed." "Then let it bleed," Edward said, leaning forward. "Because I am not marrying a niece. I am marrying Sarah." A deafening silence fell over the room. For a mafia boss to choose a homeless woman over a strategic alliance was unheard of. It was an act of defiance that challenged the very foundation of their world. "If you do this," Chairman Min whispered, "you will no longer have the protection of the board. You will be a man alone." "I have never been less alone in my life," Edward countered. As he exited the building, the storm he had expected didn't come in the form of bullets, but in the form of a public scandal. The Kangs had leaked a story to the press. The Tiger of Seoul kidnaps beggar's child to replace late wife's legacy. A montage of glowing smartphone screens and newspaper headlines showing blurry photos of Sarah and Edward at the estate, with sensationalist Korean text. Edward arrived back at the estate to find the gates surrounded by reporters. Inside, Sarah was pale, clutching Joy and Isabel. "Edward, they're saying I'm a criminal. They're saying you took Joy to force me to stay." Edward walked to her, ignoring the chaos outside. He took her hands in his. "They are trying to use the truth as a weapon because they are afraid of it, but they forgot one thing." "What?" Sarah asked. "I own the truth now." Edward turned to Jin. "Gather the press. We aren't going to hide. We're going to give them the story of the century." The grand ballroom of the Dong estate was transformed into a press arena. Hundreds of camera lenses gleamed like the eyes of predators, and the air hummed with the electric tension of a scandal reaching its breaking point. Outside, the Kang's lawyers were already preparing a lawsuit to seize Isabel, confident that Edward's homeless maid story would crumble under public scrutiny. Edward stepped onto the podium. He wasn't wearing his usual charcoal suit. He wore a dark navy blue, appearing less like a mobster and more like a statesman. Beside him stood Sarah, dressed in a simple, elegant ivory gown, her hand resting firmly in his. A press conference, a wall of photographers with flashing bulbs, faces a man and a woman standing at a mahogany podium. The background features a large, traditional Korean silk screen. "For years," Edward began, his voice amplified and steady, "the Dong-Hyun Syndicate has been built on a standard of excellence. But excellence cannot exist where there is a lie." He gestured to the large screen behind him. It didn't show financial charts. It showed the hospital logs from St. Mary's. He played a grainy, silent security video from 5 years ago, a nurse slipping a crying infant out of a ward while Sarah lay unconscious in a different room. Then, he displayed the DNA results in giant, undeniable letters. "Isabel is not a Kang," Edward declared, his gaze piercing the cameras. "She was stolen from Sarah 5 years ago by people who believed that wealth gave them the right to own human souls. I was a victim of that lie. Sarah was a victim of that theft. But today, the debt is settled." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, but Edward held up a hand. "I am stepping down as chairman of the syndicate's board to lead our new charitable foundation for displaced families," he announced, a shockwave rippling through the crowd. "And I am doing so alongside my wife." He turned to Sarah, his eyes softening. "Because the only empire worth ruling is one built on the truth." Edward's face is illuminated by the flash of cameras, the other in soft shadow, showing a resolute and peaceful expression. The Kang's influence vanished in an afternoon. Facing criminal charges for the kidnapping and fraud, they fled the country, their power neutralized by the one thing they couldn't buy, the public's moral outrage. As the cameras were packed away, Sarah leaned into Edward. "You gave up your throne for us," she whispered. "No," Edward smiled, pulling her close. "I just realized I was sitting in the wrong chair." The iron gates of the Dong estate, once a symbol of cold isolation, were thrown wide open. The morning sun bathed the sprawling gardens in a soft, honey-hued light. For the first time, the Ice King's fortress was filled with the sound of music, laughter, and the chattering of guests from all walks of life, from former syndicate allies to the local families Sarah had befriended during her time on the streets. Edward stood at the end of a stone path lined with sunflowers. He was no longer the man in the charcoal suit. He wore a light linen blazer, his gray eyes bright with a warmth that finally reached his soul. The music shifted to the familiar melody of the lullaby from the East Wing. Sarah appeared, walking toward him. She wore a gown of shimmering gold silk that mirrored the sun. Beside her, Joy and Isabel were the flower girls, their micro-braids adorned with yellow ribbons, throwing sunflower petals into the breeze. The ceremony was brief but profound. There were no mentions of mergers or power, only promises of protection, truth, and a love that had survived the darkest of nights. As the priest declared them husband and wife, Edward didn't just see a partner. He saw the woman who had returned his daughter's voice and given him his own. The kiss was long and tender, a seal on a new era. But the silence was quickly broken by a familiar, insistent tug on Edward's trousers. "Papa, Mama, cake," Isabel shouted, her voice loud and joyful. "I want yellow cake now." The guests erupted in laughter. The girl who hadn't spoken for 4 years was now the loudest person in the garden. Edward scooped Isabel up, settling her on his hip, while Sarah pulled Joy close. "The cake is coming, Isabel," Edward laughed, kissing his daughter's cheek. "I think we've waited long enough for the sweet things in life." As the afternoon faded into a golden twilight, the new family stood on the veranda, looking out over a Seoul that no longer felt like a battlefield, but a home. The gates didn't close to keep the world out. They stayed open to let the light stay in. The family of 4 standing together, as the lights of Seoul begin to twinkle. In the heart of a city built on power and shadows, a single word from a child changed everything. Edward Dong learned that the greatest standard of excellence wasn't found in a boardroom or a bank account, but in the eyes of a little girl who finally felt safe enough to speak. Sarah didn't just find her lost daughter. She found a man brave enough to tear down his own walls to build a home for them all. If this story of redemption and a mother's love touched your heart, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Every subscription helps us bring more of these journeys to life. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Which character's transformation was your favorite? And don't forget to let us know in the comments which city or country you are watching from. We cherish our global community of storytellers. Thank you for watching. Remember, it only takes one word to break a silence and one act of kindness to change a destiny. We'll see you in the next story.